My name's David Hencke. I'm a freelance journalist who's worked in Parliament actually since 1986. And I'm speaking in a personal capacity as a freelance journalist rather than representing any organisation at all. I think that's probably the best way to describe me. And I've had years of investigating issues in Parliament and also some MPs as well.
Right. Thanks so much, David. Good to see you, Mr. Hencke. Could you please just confirm for the start that you've signed the consent form and read the privacy documents and agree for this recording to be used for the purposes of the CEDAW in-law tribunal?
Yes, Your Honour, I can confirm that I have actually signed the consent form and read the terms, and I'm very happy for it to be used, the recording to be used for the purposes that you wish to use it for. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Good. And now to questions. As you said, you're a correspondent, a lobby correspondent, and you've written a great deal about the State Pension Act age deferrals. Can you tell the tribunal what, in your opinion, are the issues in relation to the pensions changes for the 1950s women?
Certainly. I mean, the biggest issue to me is that a large cohort of people, 3.8 million people, have suffered a considerable injustice by the fact that their pensions have been basically deferred for such a long period, and they've not been properly informed, consulted, or anything since the 1995 Act was passed. And the assumption has always been that somehow, like lobby correspondents, people follow legislation in great detail and parliamentary debates every day, so they should have known. But it's absolutely obvious this was not the case. And basically, these women have suffered an enormous injustice because they actually hadn't realized what was about to happen to them, and the government could have done something about it to inform them much, much earlier than they did.
And when you refer to the people who are impacted, it's the women born in the 1950s, isn't it, who have been impacted by this change?
That's
just
right.
To clarify. Yeah.
It's only women, and men have had no problem until very, very recently, when the pension age went up to 66, which affected both men and women. But this is entirely basically for an injustice for women and nobody else.
Thank you. And so what is your view of whether there was any informing of the 1950s women about this change? That is, are you aware of any action that was taken by government or by a minister or by the parliament to inform women of these changes?
Well, this is one of the most lamentable things about this. Basically, when the Back to 60 bought the Judicial Review, documents came out from the ministry showing at the time the change was mooted way back in 1995, 96, just 47,000 leaflets were prepared for 3.8 million people. And frankly, that is actually derisory contribution to tell anybody anything. And furthermore, it seemed to be targeted at people who could afford to have a pension advisor. So it would be actually the women who were perhaps the better off, who might have seen something like this, but the rest of them, they didn't. And also there was an extraordinary document that came to light involving the Social Security Secretary at the time, Peter Lilly, who before the election, I think the top civil servants at the ministry realised that the women weren't being informed, and suggested to him that he publicly did something about this to inform them. And the memo shows that he actually decided not to do anything at the time. So, and that is really, really important, because if your pension is changing or you've got a master, you can't decide in the last 5 minutes or even 5 years, oh, I must do something to sort this out and prepare. They needed that very long time, if they were going to government were doing this, to be able to prepare. And then after that, the Labour government seemed to more concentrated on a stakeholder pension, the new second pension for both men and women in work, rather than highlighting the issue of women's, informing the women. And it doesn't seem to have been until about 2008 or 9 or around there that they were actually but actually a real attempt was made to inform them. And then the government whacked a further thing onto them by raising the pension age to 66 for them. So they had to work even longer. So actually it's a lamentable, frankly, attitude by the government, who basically got out of what I think is a democratic right that people should expect to be informed of a change. And it's no good just saying, oh, we passed an act of Parliament, you should be reading it all and know. People have to be personally told so they can do something about it. So I think it's a really, really poor record for government on this.
And interesting that, as it appears, the civil servants were aware of the importance of the change and the need to inform the women, but that the political representative, ironically, of the people, as you point out, and I understand from what you've said, didn't take the civil service advice. Is that the case, appears?
That is the case. And actually, if you look at the circumstances, this was in about January 1997, when the Conservative government was towards the end of its time in office. There was a general election in June. And my suspicion, although there's no documentary proof about this, my suspicion is the ministers thought going into an election against a vibrant new Labour leader, Tony Blair at the time, and announcing to 3.8 million women that your pension, you're not going to get it till you're 65. Probably they thought, well, we'd rather not do that because we'll lose even more votes. As it turned out, they lost a huge amount of votes anyway, but that's another matter.
Right, thank you. Now, in your blog, you of course do the regular blog, and you wrote a blog on the 19th of July. It was published in 2018, some years ago now. And in that blog, you referred to the 271 billion rate, quote unquote, of the National Insurance Fund. Can you explain what you meant by that and how the tripartite agreement to fund the National Insurance Scheme worked? And if the breaking of that agreement or contract has affected the pensions of the 50s women. And when I asked this, if you'd explain what the tripartite agreement was and the National Insurance Scheme, because there'll be people watching this who are not from the United Kingdom, and also in referring to that affecting the pensions of 50s women, if you could also explain if it impacted more on the 50s women than on others, whether women or men or just men. So thank you.
All right. Now, I basically, this rather dramatic article follows research I did after Joanna Welsh asked me to look into what seemed a very strange issue to 1950s women. The government kept saying they hadn't got the money to continue paying women pensions at 60. So I then looked back into the history of this and discovered some amazing facts. I mean, the basic system, the sort of tripartite system, was set up under the Attlee government after the Second World War. And basically, under Beveridge, who was the minister at the time, the plan was to create a national insurance system that will cover everybody, not only pensions, but unemployment benefit and maternity benefit and all the benefits, and for the disabled as well. And this system basically involved the money raised from national insurance from both the employee and the employers going into a fund. But this was topped up by a third by the Treasury, which gave the extra money mainly because it wasn't just meant for pensions, it was also meant for unemployment and other, other benefits. So basically it had to cover a much wider range than being left there or, being used every year for pension payments. Now, what happened was this remained the same system till I think it would be 1988 or 89 under the Thatcher government, when John Moore, who was the Social Security Secretary at the time, without anyone noticing, including me as a lobby correspondent for that matter, quietly changed the regulations. So the Treasury stopped paying in at all to this fund. And it got marginally modified in 1994, I think, because unemployment started going into the red as a result of this. And the government thought, well, if it's in danger of absolutely going into the red, we'll allow an occasional top up. What happened after that for at least 24 years, I think there was only about 1 year that the Treasury put any money into this fund. As a result, I'll explain why I use the word rape as well. Basically, as a result of this, the fund was starved of resources. And I discovered also on the internet a wonderful bit of analysis by a former, sadly, he's no longer alive, a former Social Security advisor to David Hencke, who was Labour Social Security Secretary in the 1970s, that calculated the money was lost by this by the Treasury stopping spending money. And he used the word, actually, the rape of the fund. And that's why I use it in inverted commas, because I'm only quoting on this. And basically what has happened behind everyone's back is that this had, the fund didn't have the money. If it had had the money, and we'd say done something like, we'd say we'd even created a new fund like the Norwegians have, a sovereign wealth fund, to put all that money away, they wouldn't have been any need whatsoever for basically the pension rising for the 1950s women. There would have been easily enough money there now for these pensions to be paid. But because it wasn't there, the government think, and why it's really important for the 1950s women, and they were the first wave. They were the first people to actually lose a pension at 60 and then 61 and right up to 66. And they were really the victims of what was really a hidden austerity policy, if you like, to save public money, and they were just and they just lost out. So not only, as I said before, weren't they told properly afterwards, but the system, frankly, I suppose you could use the word, was rigged against them. And of course now the government claims, well, we couldn't possibly ever put the money back, but they're doing partly the same at the moment with pensions up to 2030, because actually in this decade there won't be so many people claiming pensions for the first time, but they're still using the decade to raise the pension age again to 67, where there's no reason, and they won't really run into a problem to about 2035. I hope that I've tried to explain it, so it's a bit complicated, but this is what happened. In other words, to put it simply, it was a con.
Great. Yes. Well, thank you. just actually back to the Attlee government introducing this, there's actually quite a lot of debate, not only in this country, but internationally, about the status of the age pension. And in some jurisdictions, the contention is, and the history appears to show, that the age pension was introduced as a right, not as a gratuity or a benefit, but it was a substantive right based in the fact that everybody in a country contributes to the GNP, to the national effort and so on, whatever they do, whether it's unpaid work, whether it's voluntary work, whether it's paid work. And therefore, at a particular age, the age pension is available because it's a right, not just some gratuity of the government. Have you come across any history in the setting up of the National Insurance Scheme where that idea was at the base of it, that the age pension is an actual right?
I think when it was set up by the Attlee government, it was considered that people should have a decent income in old age, and that would be a right. The complication that people find about this, and it's very confusing, because you have to, do sort of contribute for a particular period. It looks as though you've paid in, right, and it is your right to get the money. But the actual funding of the system is based on the money that's paid in that year, not on, the government holding on to your contributions for 35 years or so, or 40 years. And I think this is, quite a can be a bit of a problem for people to understand, because the government use the present situation in the fund to justify changes. And also there's been rather a thing that I think people have found a bit insulting, that the European Union, when we were in it, seemed to refer to the pension as a benefit. And as far as 50s women or anybody else, actually, they felt they were really insulted by this, because they regarded this as a right. It wasn't something that could be taken away from them through means testing like other benefits or something else. And I think that has actually added to the confusion. And I think the government have tried to hint, like the department sometimes refers it to, Department for Work and Pension refers to it as a benefit, when it's not actually, it is a right.
Yeah. Well, thinking back to my history, and I must say this because when I was doing history at school, we always learnt that the first pensions that were introduced actually by Bismarck in when he was he must have been the president or the chancellor of the part of Germany at the time that he was in charge. Yeah, but it came from there. Anyway, that's by the by. And because I'm coming back. Go on, sorry.
So I was going to say, by the by, I also learned a rather intriguing thing about Bismarck, that the general pension age was 65. And he's very crafty, Bismarck, because most people, the average in Germany at that time, died at the age of 64. So which I thought was just typical of governments.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, I'm glad it's correct then, because as I say, I learnt this at school and it's quite some time ago now. So, but Bismarck. Now, back to your blog. You wrote a blog, or the blog was published on the 28th of July, more recently this one, 2020. And in that blog, you referred to men only and a national insurance subsidy that went to men alone, or men only. Can you advise us somewhat more about what this blog was about and what it was based on, and why you considered it vital to bring it to attention?
Right. Well, actually, I think this was caused by one of the people, one of the 50s women who put in a Freedom of Information request when they heard about this. And basically what the story is quite interesting. It was when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. Unemployment went up a lot initially. And what she did was to bring down the unemployment figures. She realized there were quite a large cohort of men aged over 60 but under 65 who basically might have had younger wives who had already were already getting the pension, and they would also get the pension then at 60. So they introduced a temporary measure known as a sort of auto credit, which basically was for men only, but it was meant as a temporary measure because it brought the unemployment figure. If they actually agreed to having their national insurance contributions paid by the state rather than themselves for 5 years, they were and didn't actually go and claim unemployment benefit. They got 5 years, up to 5 years, people, free contributions. Now, what is interesting, it was a temporary measure. It wasn't meant to be a long-term measure. And what we discovered was, and it got corrected by the department to make it even worse, that it stayed in existence from about 1983 to 2018. And altogether, first the government admitted under one freedom of information, the 4.6 million men could benefit from this. And then they revised it up to, it was 9.8 million men who could benefit from this. And the women, were scandalously treated in the transition period after 2010 because the government promised to extend it to, and it would have helped 50s women, this free thing, and then cancelled it, but didn't phase out the men's one to 2018. So what you've got is, and why this is incredibly important, is that men were basically given a state subsidy and had their insurance, national insurance contributions paid, while women, who when they qualified for their pension got no such advantage, not even after they started raising the pension age from 60. And this is incredibly important because, frankly, I think it's a discriminatory measure. Why should men, and why actually should they have kept it for such a long period when unemployment actually was much lower and actually the country was in quite reasonable shape? It's just extraordinary. And actually, a lot of the women didn't find out because their husband knew they'd got it, but they never told them. Because this is something that came back to me. People, the husband said, "Oh, that's good, I don't have to pay this," but never told his wife that this had happened. So, I just think that I think this is incredibly important because it's an example of a discriminatory measure, and it's a discriminatory measure which, again, the 1950s born women were deprived of, or uniquely deprived of it, because it did exist for men up to 2018. During the period, they were raising the women's pensions age. So that's why I thought this was an extraordinary story. I got huge numbers of hits on this, actually.
And because what's interesting about it, apart from anything else, is that it's a double whammy, isn't it? Because you see, the men are getting a benefit and the women are getting a double negative because they're having the pension taken away on this timeline and they're not receiving the benefit that the men are getting from this contribution. But the other element of it, I think, is that, you see, if women are unemployed, they're much less likely to go on the unemployment statistics, because men, if they're unemployed, will go on the unemployment statistics because it's seen that men have jobs, real jobs, and therefore they have to be on unemployment if they haven't got one. Whereas for women, there is very much a tendency to think that the woman loses the job and then she simply does the unpaid work in the home rather than go onto the unemployment register. And I think in some jurisdictions, there's been some sort of a barrier against women going onto the unemployment benefit if there's a partner in the household that's actually in paid work. I'd have to double check, but my recollection is that there is something along those lines. And so they'd have to cover up the unemployment statistics, they'd have to pay attention to the men, which I'm certainly not saying is good. I agree with you that you could run actually a really good discrimination claim on that basis, I would have thought. Now, another blog. This one, I don't have the date for, but I'm sure you'll recall it. In your blog, Sleepwalking into the Valley of Death, you referred to the flatlining of longevity. How does this impact on 1950s women and their pensions?
Yes, this is very important. The reason why it impacts on them is that the government took what turned out to be the highest figure for longevity when it peaked at about 2010, 2011, to base their calculations on whether they could afford to pay pensions out, in the future. And the outrageous thing about this is this was used as an argument all the time publicly. And I investigated this and discovered that by 2015, it had actually flatlined. There was no increase. And by now, it's fallen. And it's also incredibly unjust for poor women. If I can give an example, women, I think they might use the average age of about 83 or something like that. But if you're in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in London and a woman, you're likely to live to 89 or something like that. If you're living in Blackpool or you're in a council estate north of Glasgow, your life expectancy is far lower, possibly even as much. I'm trying to remember the figures off the top of my head, but it may be as much as 10 years or 8 years lower. So this is really a further outrageous thing for the 1950s women, because they basically say, oh, we're having to do this, you're having to put up with this because you're all going to live longer and longer and longer. Well, that's no longer true. And furthermore, it's very, very bad news for women, and I suppose to be fair for men as well, living in poor parts of the United Kingdom, because they're not going to live so long. And some of them die before they even get a pension, actually. So that issue, I thought was another example of, you looked at what you're supposed to be told, what everybody's told, this is the real reason. And when you examine it in forensic detail, it turns out to be untrue. And actually with the COVID issue now, I suspect that future figures will show life expectancy on average is even lower than it is now.
And I would have thought that an argument might be made, would that be true, that the impact of this change through the Pensions Act of 95 and 2011, the evidence already given is that it has health impacts, and therefore it's likely to lower the age longevity of women even more, consistent. Yeah.
I would say absolutely. One of the things on my blog, I do get some very anguished comments of women who actually are pushed onto universal credit because they can't get a pension that they would have been entitled to at 60, and they've got poor health problems, they're in difficulty, they've got financial problems. I think I had someone who had to sell their house, or basically they found a landlord who would take over it because they didn't have the money, their health was failing, and this adds to stress as well. If you haven't got money and things to live, adequately. But so I would say very definitely, I would say certainly anecdotally, I haven't looked at the full figures, there is a lot of anguish, which is one reason why I took up really to run a campaign on this, because I just thought it was so monstrously unfair to this group.
Right. And now you've done investigations into this matter, and in your opinion, based on those investigations, what do they tell us and the world about the way that the government approached these changes, their implementation and so on, or bringing them about and their implementation?
Yeah, well, to be quite honest, the government come out, or successive governments of both political covers, actually, Conservative and Labour, and actually you can count the Liberal Democrats as well, as they were in the coalition 2010 to 2015, have well, basically, that the whole, what it tells me is that the government is mainly interested in finding ways to save money and doesn't seem to be, frankly, particularly bothered about who loses out. And I think that's sort of another example of why, and the 1950s women are absolutely at the top of the list for this. And I often think that the government thinks this because basically they think they can get away with discrimination against women in the sort of 55, 60 age group because they're not so visible as other groups. I think they think that they are basically a soft touch. I mean, if they're going to take on brutal steelworkers or train drivers, they suddenly find they get strikes and all sorts of them. Well, these women don't do this. These women are remarkably law-abiding. Actually, they don't do these sort of things, and actually was shown up by George Osborne, who's Chancellor. And I found this videotape, which I thought summed it all up. He gave some talk in America about saving money, and he boasted that the biggest saving he had made, which he said nobody noticed or did anything about, was raising the pension age to 65 from 60. And he thought this was a great achievement, which actually, for my mind, seemed to be a bit of a male chauvinist attitude, to put it mildly, and was certainly monstrously unfair. So I think the government thinks it can treat this group of women with a fair amount of disdain, which it is more careful to avoid with other groups, actually, and particularly to organisations who've got big lobbying groups as well.
Well, it's readily apparent that there wasn't anybody in George Osborne's audience who actually was born in the 1950s, because they're not aware, therefore, they've forgotten that that's where a large cohort came from that was active in the 1970s in the women's movement, in the women's liberation movement. And so they're not even up with their history, you see, or their herstory, perhaps one might put it like that way. It's unfortunate there wasn't somebody in the audience, the George Osborne audience, or some man who would have stood up for women. It's a tragedy, pity. Anyway, on to the next issue. Is there any support for parliamentary mechanisms that could have an impact or provide a remedy for these issues? For example, have there been any parliamentary motions or debates or early day motions that you're aware of where some members of parliament at least are au fait with this issue and who actually care about the economic status of 1950s women and their rights?
Yes, they were. There was quite an early day motion that was signed by a lot of MPs. I forget the number, but certainly almost a majority of MPs during this time demanding this. And actually, to give them some credit, the Labour Party in the last election under John McDonnell as Shadow Chancellor and Jeremy Corbyn as the Shadow Leader, John McDonnell particularly realised there was an injustice here and actually stuck in the very late. I think he should have done it earlier because he could have explained it better. Because he did it at the last minute, it got rather heavily dismissed. So saying, if you elect me, I'm going to put aside money to actually compensate this money, the women. I mean, it wasn't been an absolute full restitution, but it was a substantial sum of money, about £60 billion. And he definitely took this on. The Conservatives actually didn't and have stalled all the time. And I think there is some measure that you could use, which I've forgotten the exact title at this second, to pass a parliamentary motion to actually pay this money if you wanted to do this. But of course, the government has got no appetite to do this whatsoever. And the present one frankly, as far as I can see, is not at all bothered and in any way, shape or form. I mean, there was a motion, a more recent motion that was signed by a number of MPs as well, calling for that, calling for the women to get full restitution. But it was signed actually by a smaller number of MPs than the first one, which is a shame. I mean, I might explain later about the sort of circumstances that have led to this sort of impasse and the way the ministry has behaved since, actually.
I think there'll be an opportunity, certainly, for that. So, in your reports on the Back to 60 court proceedings, the judicial review of July 2020 and September 21, and subsequently, where the Supreme Court stated that the judicial review application was out of time, what conclusions did you come to in terms of the judiciary's approach to this question?
Well, this I thought was very unfair, what happened at the Supreme Court, because the judicial review, I remember at the time reporting it, the permission for the judicial review was granted by a woman judge. Funnily enough, it's a 1950s woman. She basically listened to the case, and I remember press colleagues and other people saying, no, they'll never get this through. No one, you know, it will be seen as too expensive and everything else. And then they got a complete shock because this judge actually said, yes, it was an urgent thing that needed sorting out, purely just because it had happened in 1995. The key point for the 1950s women was they were suffering now. They weren't suffering in 1997, 2003. They were suffering now. And therefore, the government's policy was open, and she granted it on every ground. It was a considerable victory, and the Department for Work and Pensions was so shocked they demanded extra days to respond because they weren't expecting to, and they had to do something about it. And then it went to the court, the High Court, and then to the Court of Appeal. And in both cases, they lost. And I think they were particular reasons, which I might come on to later, about the court not understanding what CEDAW was, because the lawyers actually argued a case that included that it was just, though it appeared to be superficially an equality measure, it actually was actually a discriminatory measure, even under CEDAW convention, because basically it wasn't comparing like with like. Men had been able to, unless they unfortunately became unemployed, were able to work right through, get a full pension. Women were working part-time, sometimes didn't earn enough money to even get a national insurance contribution while at work, and all the things. So therefore it wasn't like with like until the mid-70s, even when they were looking after children at home, they didn't get a credit. They did after that, but it was never backdated. It was never backdated earlier, which would have actually helped a particular cohort of women as well. And then when it gets to the Supreme Court, it turns out that they decided it's out of time. Well, how can something be out of time if it's been in time to start with? Was never, although they moaned about it, the DWP lawyers, about having to defend this, they never applied at the High Court to get it reversed. They never applied at the Court of Appeal to get it reversed, although they did argue the case that they didn't believe it should have been granted. And suddenly the Supreme Court decided not. I'd looked into this. Now, the Supreme Court in Britain has actually had quite a good reputation under Brenda Hale when she was chair. We had a woman chair, and I remember there was a famous challenge against Boris Johnson when she said that he'd acted illegally. But I looked at the composition now, and the composition that heard this thing back, and it's 11 men and 1 woman. Now, this is outrageous in the 22nd century. I mean, and it's interesting because I heard a talk by Brenda Hale. If you are a criminal and are going to be put before the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey, the judges, all the appointed judges, are 50% men and 50% women, which is what it should be, really. In the Supreme Court, it's what, 90+% men. And I've looked at the judgments of the person who's turned down this thing for women, and found that the present president of the Supreme Court has actually approved a number of other harsh judgments affecting women and children, including one over benefits, about having 2 children, whether you should actually get some benefit further. Well, he actually found against women and children on that, on the grounds that the government's got to keep public spending down. Now, to my mind, I don't know whether that's the role of the judiciary. I think that's the role of the Treasury. And looking at his record, it looked like, frankly, or unless I get dragged before the court for contempt, was frankly just discriminatory and unfair. And I mean, he looks quite hostile to me. I think there was another case I discovered, but that was the one that really struck out to me. And I think actually they should have heard it. I mean, they can't suddenly decide, oh, it was out of time, so we can't hear it. And you almost think there may have been some fix here to, we don't want this going on anymore because it's embarrassing and MPs have been demanding the women get the money and all that. I mean, one can't know because he didn't give any reasons except saying it's out of time. It's just a one-liner, which is, and frankly, also totally unsatisfactory for the top court in the UK. So I'm afraid I took rather a dim view of that.
Well, just on the matter of women's representation, Aotearoa, New Zealand had a woman Chief Justice, a woman Prime Minister, and a woman Governor General all at the same time. And heavens, that was back in the 1990s. And the Supreme Court of Canada has had a woman as the Chief Justice and a majority of women. They've got 9. The court here's got 12. They've got 9, and they've had a majority of women at least one time. And the Australian High Court's got a Chief Justice woman and a number of women on it too. They've only got 7, but they have, it's either 3 or 4. But on the other point about the economic impact, there's a wonderful article about the Supreme Court of the United States where the point is being made that at the present time, they're endeavouring to turn themselves into historians. They're not turning themselves into so-called economists. They're turning themselves into historians. And they're not historians, they're lawyers. And anybody who's a historian recognises that there are disputes about what is and isn't history. And so it does appear that we've got some very strange element transporting itself into the world of the judiciary. Anyway, on to another matter. Yeah. The CEDAW committee in March 2019 made concluding remarks in its review of the United Kingdom position on CEDAW, made concluding remarks on this aspect. And do you have any comment to make about their concluding remarks in this regard?
Well, actually, in the regard that one of the really bad things is that one good thing is Margaret Thatcher, a woman Prime Minister, signed up to CEDAW, which, you know, way back in 1986. But the fact that we have only half-heartedly, and I think this is a point they made, and correct me if I'm wrong, implemented CEDAW. I mean, through the Equality Act, some of the provisions are covered. And the fact that now CEDAW itself has told the committee, has told the British government that they actually need to basically get on with it, and if they've signed up to something, they should actually implement it properly in law. Suggests to me this is this has been a really bad situation, because they could have implemented it, and it's slightly worse because Nicola Sturgeon, the woman First Minister in Scotland, wants to implement CEDAW in full, and also the rights of the child, and also racial discrimination and disabled women, all conventions we've signed to. And Boris Johnson went to that same Supreme Court over the rights of the child, and actually said, sorry, this is Westminster's power, we don't want you, you can't do it, which I think is disgrace. Why can't they introduce these laws in Scotland, actually? And actually, given Britain signed up to it, they're not doing anything, they're not signing a treaty with one of our enemies or something, off the bat. They are actually doing, so I do find that, I'm not going over to the point, but I find actually the government's attitude has been completely lamentable, because you shouldn't sign up to things that you're not going to really implement properly, and they haven't, and it would have made quite a big difference if they had, I think, to the 50s women's case, actually.
Right. Well, now to that, the next question then. If CEDAW were to be domesticated, that is, incorporated into United Kingdom law as a Women's Bill of Rights, what benefit do you see accruing to women generally, and to 1950s women in particular?
Women generally, if it was implemented, we wouldn't have to wait to 2040 to get equal gender pay. It would have to be speeded up enormously, and that would affect millions of women in work at the moment. For the 50s women, I mean, it rather comes back to the observation I thought of when I was watching the Court of Appeal and over that case. There was a judicial review, because it was quite clear that the lawyers were sort of saying, well, actually, there is a case under CEDAW, and this is why, and it's discriminatory, and so on. But my feeling was the judges were thinking, well, that's just a convention. It's not part of British law in full at the moment. And I think if it had been part of British law, they would have had very great difficulty in refusing the 50s women case, because it would be written into it. And also it couldn't be used, I mean, I'm no lawyer, but lawyers tell me that one of the great things about CEDAW is that you can't, if you've got a discrimination case, you sometimes have to choose, is it racial discrimination, is it sexual discrimination, it's something else. This looks at the whole ramifications of everything that affects women, and has to be taken into account. And if that had been taken into account in the Court of Appeal and the High Court, I think the 50s women would have won, because it just changes. It changes what I would say, the music, the culture, the way lawyers will have to approach it. And because it's part of our domestic law, it can't be ignored. And in fact, it would presumably build up a big set of case law over CEDAW eventually that would really sort of improve a lot. And I think it would improve the lot of women. There are lots of other things as well that it could impinge on. It might even impinge on the abortion debate if anyone tries to follow, the Wade case, the Roe versus Wade thing. Luckily, nobody seems to be doing that at the moment, I must say, but you never know actually what happens here. So that's my feeling. A big change would make an enormous difference.
Yes, a strong argument can be made about the abortion rights issue under CEDAW, I would have thought, yeah. But in your reports from February 2022 and subsequently, you've talked about a number of different bodies and the possible actions that they might be able to take, the actions that they've taken and what they may be able to do. I'll give you the acronyms and you can spell them out and say what you think in relation to each of them. There's the PSHO, there's the DWP, there's the APPG, and those three entities or bodies or conurbations of human beings like the APPG, for example. What would you say about each of those and pensions, as well as the actions of Lord Reid?
Right. Well, first of all, for the public, the Parliamentary and Health Ombudsman, the PSHO. Now, this at the moment is being used by WASPI group to bring a maladministration case over this thing. And I have looked at the role of the Ombudsman. First of all, the legislation that set him up is, I think goes back, over 50 years, and it is needed with it needs some massive revamp. For example, the Ombudsman in, the Parliamentary Ombudsman here can't initiate an investigation at all without an MP agreeing to it. And this is really a ridiculous situation to be in. The Northern Ireland one now can, but the rest of them can't. But also his powers are pathetic, to be quite honest. This case of the, what at the moment is, it seems the 1950s women and probably 1960s women as well, are basically hoping that the Parliamentary Ombudsman, having already said there is some maladministration, but only partial. And I actually disagree with that finding, because as I pointed out in my earlier evidence, there's evidence way back in 1997 that the government didn't take any notice of that, but he's decided it was only maladministration from 2005. He then does a report. He then has to do another report on to decide whether it is worthy of compensation or not, and then finally do a final one about what the compensation will be. And this will take years. And it's people who've pinned themselves on this, I think, have made quite a big mistake. I think it was much better to try the judicial review, even though it failed. Now, what is even worse than this, and I can give you an example, a parallel example. I've got an expert, and I've done a blog on this, about the guaranteed minimum pension, which was abolished in 2016 when the new pension scheme in. Well, two people complained to them that they had lost out. And the Ombudsman awarded them a sum of compensation out of this, because they didn't know. Because this is another thing, the department never told anyone about that either. And they got, I don't know, 500 quid and 750 quid each. He then recommends that the DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, sort of compensates them and draws up a plan. The department doesn't bother to reply for ages, then puts out a little table and a note on it, which basically no one would really find very easy. There's no publicity campaign, there's nothing to say the Ombudsman's decided you could get some compensation. And as a result of this, only two people, the same two people, have got compensation. Yet, according to, I've got an expert who advises me, who's a retired pensions expert, who says actually there are probably millions of people entitled. And because it's been so obscure, A, didn't do what the Ombudsman asked, and B, what they did do has only been viewed by 16 people. This is terrible, actually, and this shows how, in fact, he can't do anything more about it, actually. So in a way, the Ombudsman is not a brilliant route, or not the present ombudsman in this country. I mean, when there's a new, I mean, funny enough, you get a better one in Northern Ireland, who I notice has started initiating things into the disabled being discriminated against and so on, without waiting for one complaint, and just limiting it. So one, I think it's weak, and it's going to take ages, and those who are hoping to get compensation are going to have to wait a long time if they get it, because the Department for Work and Pension can ignore it. And if I come on to them, yes, the Department of Work and Pensions has a terrible record on this. They do tend to ignore things they don't want to do, and it's very difficult to force them to do something. As actually Sir Stephen Timms, who's chair of the Work and Pensions Committee in Parliament, has told me. I mean, he's written letters taking up that case I've done, and have had letters back from the Permanent Secretary saying, "Oh, we are doing this, that, and the other." But he said, "Well, that's not what I've asked for. I want this." And the department's slow in replying. They don't. They're not keen on really doing anything much. So I think and the department. All I'll say about the Department of Work and Pension, I've just done a blog about the latest accounts of the department for 2021 to this April. They show for the 34th year running, the auditor of the DWP, the National Audit Office, have qualified their accounts because they're not accurate. They have had record amounts of fraud on universal credit. Actually, it's about 8.5 billion or something fraud altogether this year. They've had record numbers of pensioners who've been underpaid dating back to 1985. It's all in the report. And furthermore, just to really rub salt into the wounds, 7 of the 11 top people have all been given bonuses this year for a department that has had an abysmal report from its auditors, which from that, I think just some, I don't have to say any more than that, what I think about that. Now, as for the APPG on pension, I'm afraid I'm critical about this as well, because they had an opportunity, the new one, which is an all-party committee that looks at 50s women and injustice, to take quite a tough line on this. I mean, they're members of Parliament. So if the members of Parliament of that committee say, "I demand to see the Secretary of State," or "I demand to see the Pensions Minister," the answer would be that they would be very bad form for the Pensions Minister to refuse to see them. But instead, they seem to be enticed to follow the Ombudsman route. And I pointed out there are serious flaws in the role of the present Ombudsman, which is going to take much longer for the women to get justice, if they get justice at all. And if the department does what they did to the guaranteed minimum pension people, they'll just pay the 6 people who were owed, and then not do anything about the rest, or say it's too complicated. And I think they should have taken a much more robust attitude and gone to the thing and started quoting the early day motions in the past, saying, "Look, all these MPs think, come on, you're going to have to do something. What are you going to do? Or do you want this running on? And you could end up with people voting against you for particularly that court, because that court is still powerful. I mean, I think the Isle of Wight, they've got about 15,000 of them. I mean, I know it's nearly equal to the Tory majority in the Isle of Wight, so they could actually, if they said, "Well, we're voting you out, but we're going to sorry, your local MP, but your government won't do anything for us. Why should we support you?" So generally, I'm afraid it's awful. It sounds though I'm continually critical, but I suppose what annoys me overall is that you look at these things, and on the surface they sound fair, quality for pension age, other things of longevity, yes, that had grown. But when you start forensically examining, you find they're not true. and basically they're conning the public, actually, by saying this. And I think if the public do realise to extent they are women in the, born in the 1950s who suffered, but and they're sympathetic. But basically, if our political leaders and people in powerful positions took a much more robust attitude, I think they would get somewhere. And it shouldn't just be left back to 60, actually, to try and raise the flag for this. And WASPI, I mean, frankly, I am a bit critical of them because I think again they could have done more, really. And also relying on the Ombudsman is not, for the reasons I've said, is no guarantee. They need much more direct approaches to ministers to get them to change their mind. So that's my view.
Thanks, thanks, David. Now, what about Lord Reid? Did you have any comment on Lord Reid, who's had some word to say?
Lord Reid, the president of the Supreme Court.
Mm. Oh, I think you've already mentioned him, haven't you? So perhaps enough.
Yes, so, well, yeah, Fred, I wrote a really strong blog saying I didn't accuse him of being a misogynist because I thought it might be libelous, but I did say his judgments appeared to rail on misogyny because it looked like children were put last to other issues he was covering. So actually, he does seem with a small c, a conservative view. And basically, it's not a good sign. I mean, what with what's going on in America, I mean, it's not as dramatic as that, but it's nevertheless, it's. I do think, and actually, I think they should do something pretty quickly to appoint far more women to it. And I'd like to know how on earth the selection process just ended up with one woman judge, out of the whole lot, because that seems quite wrong. It's almost as though they're saying, oh, Brenda Hale as a woman was too powerful or something, caused too much controversy. So we better be quiet. And I hope they're not being cowed by, this present Conservative government, which seems to be wanting to tamper with the judiciary as well. And I'm wondering whether that might be something we don't know about. But and certainly Boris Johnson was making it clear, and Dominic Raab is, that they want to reduce rights and powers to scrutinise government, which is bad news for everybody, not just 50s women. So,
the judicial review. Bill, yes, but there's actually a really interesting article that was about women judges in Canada, and how it was some time ago now, and how that did actually impact on the decision making. And so it's not that they were finding all the time for women, far be it from anybody to suggest that, but their approach and their socialisation was different because of the socialisation that they'd done, that had been their life history.
Yeah. Oh,
right. Well, do you have anything further that you'd like to add, Mr. Hencke, on this issue of the 50s women, and this process that we're undergoing in order to investigate and to look into the position?
Well, I'm still keeping an eye on it, actually. But the moment I've been scrutinising another injustice which would affect some 50s women. I had a mole in the Department of Work and Pensions who is in the pension side, and he basically leaked, and I think I can talk about this publicly because there's been an inquiry and he was exonerated, actually. The management of the Department for Work and Pensions were having to deal with lots of pension applications and so on, and also pay back people whom they should have, who've lost pension. And he sent me this amazing screenshot of a scheme called Drop and Go. What that was if you get a complicated request for a pension and you've got a simpler one, dump the complicated one and do as many simple ones as possible because the numbers will go up. Now, this was discriminatory against women because women were mainly the complicated ones because they'd been in and out of work and they had to calculate all sorts of different things. Men were fairly straightforward because they'd been in, well, particularly that generation, may have even had the same job or the same similar job for, for their lifetime. And basically leaked this, and this caused some massive embarrassment. I was rung by an angry Department for Work and Pensions saying, why hadn't I alerted them to this and the other? And I just said, well, why should I, particularly because I knew it was true. There was no question of this. And actually it's been taken up by the chair of the Social Security the Work and Pensions Committee, rather, and the Public Accounts Committee have written to the DWP demanding an explanation of what they're doing because they thought it was quoting my blog in considerable detail. The interesting thing is the government was supposed to reply on June the 8th. They asked them to, and they haven't bothered to reply, the DWP. But I think they'll chase them up because I don't think they can just ignore two chairs of, parliamentary committees. So this is just another thing that is going on, suggesting there's still active discrimination that affects women. And also in the annual report, I might add, it said that widows who have been underpaid are being put on the back burner for other people and won't be sorted out till 2024. So they've got to work another 2 years. And I bet you that includes some 1950s women as well who would have been waiting for that. And that is just another example of this attitude that women aren't being given their equal rights when they're equal numbers of women and men in this country. So I think I would add that as a further thing, and I'm hoping to get a result out of that. And they can't do anything with my guy because he left, actually. But I mean, it was very interesting because I was talking to someone working in the DWP, even unofficially. He really cared about pensioners and that women and disabled people weren't getting, which is why I got into trouble and was outraged at, this manipulation of figures to dump various people who just because they're complicated and not easy. So he's now got a good job in a charity advising people who have got debt problems, and I think he'd be very good at it. Anyway.
And on the Department of Work and Pensions officer being concerned that you hadn't alerted them, clearly you had alerted them because they were contacting you and saying you hadn't. If they hadn't known, then they wouldn't be contacting you, would they? So anyway, I'm just making a point.
Oh, I think they knew, but they were furious it had been leaked, and they probably wanted. What was interesting, it made me realise my blog must be heavily read because it was within about 2 hours of it appearing in the DWP that they contacted me, and they're obviously worried about it because they know I've got quite a big readership among pensioners, particularly 50s women, and actually it's the role of journalists to hold people to account, and that's what I try and do, actually, as well as being sympathetic to the plight of what I regard as one of the most egregious injustices, given the number of people affected that we've had in recent years. Okay.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Hencke, David, for appearing before the tribunal. And we're now about to go to a short break. But before we do, I'll just, I really need to make the point that although the back to 60s women were extremely disappointed in the failure of the court to hear their judicial review, they nonetheless respect the decision and consider that they need to take other measures, such as this CEDAW in-law tribunal. So Lord Reid is perfectly placed in terms of doing his job.